Casual here. A little while ago I posted a video of my Anomaly Technomancer Toxic build that I used to get to Challenge Tier 15 solo. A link to this build guide is on the screen now. Since then we've seen some nerfs to the game, in particular to emergency stance, and of course I've been racking up the hours in the expeditions, picking up plenty of legendary items and Tier 3 mods as a result. I have continued to tweak this build and thought now would be a good time to share with you what I have done with it. I will also give you my thoughts on where this build stands in comparison to the firepower builds, and also run through some pretty detailed theory crafting. Use the chapters to jump to the bits that are of most interest to you, but for now, let's get into it. The class tree for this build is focused on buffing anomaly power, toxic damage and toxic duration, picking up exposing toxin, marked for execution and adrenalizing antenna are all critical for the build. I've made two changes from the original build. I'm picking up 20% resistance, given we are all a lot squishier than we were before, and I dropped one toxic duration buff in order to pick up wipeout. The toxic damage you are dealing is enough to kill basic enemies without the extra duration, and for elites you are going to be shooting them again to finish them off, which will reapply toxic anyway, so the execution buff is more useful. For my skills I have swapped out Cryo Turret for Cold Snap. The key reason for this is the mod Icicle Storm, which allows me to wipe out large packs of enemies very quickly by training them together and triggering the explosion. To buff this even more I have slotted the tier 3 mod Shatter. If you don't have that, then the tier 2 mod Freezing Boost will work nearly as well. Icicle Storm is just a great mod, not least because it is so easy to get. Tiago sells the legendary armor piece it is on, so pick it up as soon as you can and learn it. I'm also using the mod Ice component to convert Blighted Turret to freeze enemies. With Blighted rounds I am already applying Toxic with my main weapon. Freeze is also a great crowd control which has saved me on many occasions and makes critical shots that little bit easier. I use the Blighted Turret rather than Cryo because of its very short cooldown, which enables me to keep adrenalizing antenna up all the time and its 30% anomaly buff. I'm going to talk a little bit of theory crafting now, as to get the most from the build you need to understand how stasis effects and the mods work. So jump to the next chapter if you don't need to know about this. You will be missed though. I'm sure that all of you know that there are 3 stasis effects that do damage: bleed, toxic and burn. I've spent countless hours testing these effects to see how they actually perform, rather than how the game says they should perform. The guide says that bleed is 1% worse than toxic, but what I found was that the base damage is pretty much the same for all of them, with burn just a tiny bit better on each tick. It was also clear that even basic enemies have some resistance, as the base damage of toxic came in at 2.6% of anomaly power, and not the 3.5% the game states. The really important thing I found though was that the buffs to stasis effects also buffed the damage done by other stasis effects. So Radical Therapy, which increases damage done to enemies afflicted with toxic by 15%, also increases any damage done by bleed or burn. In addition, the impact is compound. What I mean by that is that if bleed and tox are applied, say with Radical Therapy and Bloody Boost modded, then the damage is actually the base damage multiplied by 115% for Radical Therapy, and then that total is multiplied by 115% for the Bloody Boost. Effectively a buff of 32.25% rather than the additive boost of 30% you might expect of the 2 mods. So in theory, to maximise your status damage, you should apply all 3 effects and mod the buffs for all 3. Now in reality of course there are other mods that improve your damage output more, and so I settled on Toxic and Burn as being my 2 to focus on, the latter because Bullet Kindling is a 20% buff compared to the 15% buff for Bloody Boost. Let's jump to the gear and the mods to see how this is all pulled together. I'm running 3 mods to buff toxic damage: Radical Therapy and Toxic Piercer, which are tier 2 mods, and Euthanizer, which is a tier 3 mod that drops from the Plague Sower hands. For burn I am running Bullet Kindling. Euthanizer was a tough one to get that took plenty of grinding. What I would suggest is running with Vein Ripper until it does, which applies bleed on a critical hit, or Freezing Boost, which further buffs your damage against frozen enemies. I'm running Captain Hunter, a tier 3 mod that buffs damage against elites by 25% and drops from the gauntlets of the cannibal. These do seem to drop fairly regularly, but until they do, you could slot Bloody Boost, which buffs bleed damage if you have already slotted Vein Ripper. The final damage related mod that I am using is To the Bone, a tier 3 mod that drops from the Plague Sower's coat and buffs your anomaly power by 30% when Blighted Rounds is activated. Given its status effects scale off AP, this gives me a very nice buff to my damage output every time Blighted Rounds is activated, helping me burn down elites quickly. You can see this in effect here. My base AP is 148,000. Activating Blighted Rounds triggers Adrenalizing Antenna and To the Bone, boosting my AP to 253,000, increasing my damage output by just over 70%. I'm currently running just one survivability mod, Perseverance Shield. Now this might seem a bit aggressive given the nerfs of damage mitigation, but that is where the strength of this build comes in. Technomancer's heal is based on the damage they do, which includes status effects. I aim to have dots on multiple enemies all the time, which means that I have a stream of healing constantly. So all I am modding for here is to prevent a one-shot, because after taking damage I'm going to heal fully in seconds. I think that Perseverance Shield is the best damage mitigation mod for this, because shields provide damage mitigation which stops both physical damage and anomaly damage. Now if you're struggling with this, or even before you have some of the tier 3 mods I've talked about, I would recommend slotting Damage Absorber in addition to Perseverance Shield. This provides a nice buff to your physical and anomaly damage mitigation, which will smooth out damage spikes and allow you to heal through them. Another damage mitigation mod that you might have seen in other content is Mitigation from Death. This is a great mod for firepower builds, but it just doesn't work for this one. The reason is that it only procs when a killing shot takes down an enemy, and with this build the majority of the time it will be your status effects that do this, so it just doesn't work. That is also why I'm not running Toxic Lead, Vampiric Mag or any other ammo replenishment mod, because they only proc on killing shots. On the other hand, Icicle Storm triggers just when afflicted enemies are killed, which is perfect because any source of damage will result in the explosion. For my main weapon I'm using a light machine gun with armor piercing and status power. Anomaly power and status power are key to have on every piece of gear to boost status effect damage. Armor piercing is also good for two reasons. Firstly, I do notice that with elites my weapon damage feels much stronger with this, and secondly, Toxic Piercer scales off this stat. I have to be honest though, that I don't think that Toxic Piercer is a great mod because it only buffs toxic damage, so there's no compound effect on your other status effects. Once I have the right armor piece, I am thinking about swapping this out for Vein Ripper to add a bleed effect to my build and to compound the damage that brings. In terms of mods on my main weapon, I'm running Death Chains and Wrath of Moloch from the Inferno Seed Legendary Assault Rifle, which applies burn. Some of you may be wondering why I'm not just using Inferno Seed itself. This whole build is about applying status effects to as many enemies as you can. Weapon damage is not a big source of your damage output, and Inferno Seed is a tactical assault rifle built for a firepower build. Having a big mag which allows you to apply status effects to a ton of enemies will give you the best result, and that's why an LMG works so well. If you don't have Wrath of Moloch, then there are a number of tier 2 mods that will apply burn, so I would slot one of them. When Blighted Rounds is on cooldown, I swap to my secondary weapon, Lucky Jinx. The only reason I'm running this gun is because of its mod Ultimate Toxic Bullets that allows me to keep toxic up on all enemies all the time. You have a couple of options with this if you don't have this gun or this mod. Any LMG, double gun or assault rifle with toxic bullets on it will do, or if you're running 2 damage mitigation mods and don't need the constant heals, you could just run with 2 damage mods on your gun like Damage Link, Claymore, Storm Whip or Death Chains, which is what I use on my main weapon. It is one of the best single target damage mods out there. The other mod I have on Lucky Jinx is Shadow Comet, which does great single target and AoE damage. This is particularly useful in proccing Icicle Storm. Again, there are good 2-tier alternatives for this. The way I play this build is to start by applying status effects to as many enemies as I can, which gets damage and healing going. I try to keep mobile to avoid elite one-shots, throwing out my turret immediately on cooldown to keep crowd control and buffs up, and reapplying status effects to elite enemies as often as possible. If there are large packs of enemies, I use Icicle Storm to take them down quickly. If I am fighting a solo elite, then I typically use my main weapon, as Death Chains and Wrath of Moloch deliver stronger damage output overall. So how does this build stack up? We all know that firepower builds are in a great place right now, and in terms of the fastest clearing of content, they can't be beaten if you can land your shots. For casual players like me, that isn't always guaranteed though. You watch some of those great content creators out there and it's like they're firing a laser. I play on an Xbox and I think I'm pretty good, but some of these people are lights out in comparison. Maybe they are playing on a PC, which with a mouse you can hit headshots time after time, but with a controller it's not so easy. Where this build shines is that it is a great grinding build that has huge survivability. One of the big issues with the firepower builds is that unless you are landing shots, you aren't being healed. So when that alpha nearly one-shots you, it's tough to get yourself back up in time to survive, which is a big problem for the solo player. With this status-based build, you can make mistakes and the build will carry you through. It will get you to CT15 solo pretty easily, which is all you really need to then to grind for the best gear. I am within 20 seconds of getting gold on CT15 solo with this build, and I think I should be able to do it soon. With a couple of different pieces, I will definitely be there. So for us mortals who play solo a lot of the time, I think that this is a great build. You don't have to be a literal god to make it work. Let me know any thoughts you might have in the comments below. Until next time, Casual out.